We are back, and we have three amazing researchers today. We have Alison Lee, who is at Mount Sinai. She's going to be giving a talk tomorrow. We have Pedro Haro, who is the executive director of the American Lung Association in Hawaii. He's been a big supporter of the registry, MauiWES, since the beginning. You know, one of the reasons why actually we got the state funding. And then we have David Abramson, which he just gave an amazing presentation as well. So we have like a super informal panel where basically we're just going to be asking them what are their main takes for today, and then we're going back to you actually for any. Basically, we're going to be posting some questions for you to add to the agenda, and everything is going to be transcribed to an executive summary that many people ask us to provide. So anyway, so I guess the first question for the panel is, what are your main takes from today?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much, Ruben and Alika and Jonas, and everyone for organizing it. This has been a really exceptional day, and I've learned so much. So maybe just a round of applause. And actually, you know, for me, what I found really inspiring, especially about the last talk about Flint, was really the community co-development model, which my understanding from your talk really built community trust and buy-in. And so I actually was thinking maybe we could open it up to different audience members from community groups and other organizations, because I would really love to hear from you, your thoughts and your reflections on the presentations, and your thoughts about how, whether it's the MauiWES study or the registry, should move forward and really try to build that trust, which I know they've already been working hard on, but how do they continue to build that trust to try to make this as exceptional a research and policy product as possible. So I'd love to open it up to group members.
Aloha, everybody. So, Executive Director of the American Lung Association, as Ruben mentioned, Lahaina is actually my hometown. This is where I grew up. Lahaina Luna graduate, went to King Kamehameha III, spent my afternoons swinging from the tree. Right next to it, my family was all here, 26 people in my immediate family were displaced that day in August. I was in the middle of doing interviews about air quality as I was still waiting to hear where my sister was, where my different family members were, only to find out about several of our neighbors and family friends that were lost in the fire. So this is professionally obviously of importance to myself. I have never worked in anything that had personally affected me, is what I would always used to like to say in public health. Never worked with immigration communities. I had never worked with people that had that I could say I have a personal story to relate. And it sort of found us in that way. One thing that what happened when Alika and Ruben approached the American Lung Association to talk about that they were running out of funding, and what has come through to me as a thorough line is that in order for this work to continue, there needs to be dedicated funding. That is more than a year, that is more than 2 years, that is more than 3 years, and that it is ample, flexible funding that is available. One other thing that has, in being able to see about the registries and the different research that has been happening across the nation is that as much as we can learn from each of the groups, it is evident that we're also building the plane as we're flying it. Right? There really isn't the precedent to be able to say to work at the speed that these researchers have moved in. The Roots Reborn being formed immediately to be able to help out a population that really had no support system built in prior to the Lahaina fires. Issues that were exacerbated by the fire, such as housing, availability of affordable housing, and all of those were just moved into astronomical levels here in Hawaii, and particularly on West Maui, obviously. But it all comes back to having that availability of funding. And the researchers having to do the funding, search for that funding, while at the same time building the community trust, building the research models, being able to put together everything here, having their staff, coordinate travel and all of these different things, everything, from lay to the pens and everything, all of that, without having any dedicated funding past, a certain period. So it's very easy for all of this to go away very quickly and to be nothing but a memory of saying, wow, that was a really good thing that they did way back then. So I believe that it is our collective responsibility to figure out how do we continue this, how do we go back into our respective offices and figure out how do we put this into our agenda. Because what we know is that a high tide lifts all boats. It doesn't matter if the populations that they're working with are directly the populations that you're working with in your office. It doesn't matter if you're assigned to Maui or not. It doesn't matter if you're working on the Lahaina recovery effort. For us to be, we are all trying to reach the same people, which are vulnerable populations, which are people who are affected by health, which are all, so being able to lift the people and figure out infrastructures are all models that we can learn from wherever they were coming from. So regardless as to whether there's a direct impact to the work that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, by being able to figure out how do we continue this work, there will be a tie-in to everything that we do. And I'm not talking the people in this room. Obviously, you're all here because it directly relates to what you're doing. But I'm talking about other people in the community that are saying, great work, nice, keep doing it, but are not really putting their vested interest, their dollars, their ability to be able to put that together so that the research can continue. So to me, that is my walk away, thought. Not in what can I do with my organization, what can I do personally to be able to secure that funding, to be able to build that trust within the community, because nothing will erode trust more quickly than for this to go away. And for all of these people that are depending on this research, that are depending for the services that are provided, to disappear. So that is my challenge to each one of you, is what is the value that you now bring to this? What can you personally bring? What can your organization bring? What can your contacts bring? What connections can you make to be able to continue this work to happen? Because I think what we can all agree on is that it's great work. What I think we have to do that extra step is to figure out what is it now that we can do to be able to continue it.
Hola, Pedro.
So there were sort of two themes that I was hearing today. One of them is a looking backward theme, and one of them is a looking forward theme. So the looking backward has a lot to do with exposure. And I think you guys have done an amazing job of characterizing exposure, which is really critical in the early days, the early weeks, months, year, to make sure that you've picked up a lot of the exposure characteristics, as well as prior vulnerabilities and disparities. So I think that's well-grounded, well-established, and you're on a good path for that. And we heard from others what that might look like and how to make sure that you refine that exposure assessment, let's say, to get the wildfire exposome, essentially. The looking forward is a much more difficult task, because we're talking about what are the ultimate impacts, the health impacts. What is life going to look like? How is the community going to be redeveloped and reconstructed? And so if you think about it as the community is at a pivot point right now between short-term recovery and long-term recovery. It's happening right around now, and it's happening around us. And there's a lot of discussion in the scholarship, the scholarly literature, about speed versus deliberation. So there's an urge for speed of reconstruction that's driven by community residents that just want to come back, live in their homes, get back to their lives, enough already of all the craziness and the transiency. And there's also speed from real estate and development interests and economic interests that are also eager to see things back up and running. And it comes at the expense of deliberation. Can we take a moment to think about what a healthier, fairer, more equitable life would look like while we have that opportunity to rebuild our community and bring people back from wherever they are. And so right at that pivot point of thinking of the speed versus deliberation, there are two major areas where you can make a difference, where this study can make a difference, and that's in community engagement and discussion, and in policy engagement and discussion. Those two aspects both have to be brought to a table using the information and data that you might be able to provide, both from what you've already done, what you could collect, what you may have heard from others, in other disasters, and what we've brought to bear. So that the community understands, oh, we do have a time that we could sit back and maybe think about what it is that we want and how fast we want to make it happen, and are we willing to wait a little bit longer if it pays in the long run. And somehow you get the policy community at the table to listen as well. And I think that's probably a harder one to bring to the table, the real policymakers and decision makers, than it is the community. So, I would like to hear that discussion of, if there was that kind of community deliberative discussion, what would people want to see? Would they be willing to think about aspirationally what would be the right community, the good community, the equitable community for us? And what kind of policymakers would we want to bring to the table?
I love that approach. And I guess I would also ask, maybe in your own work or in other speakers, what resiliency pieces you've seen in your work that have helped communities recover. Because, in a lot of the talks we've heard about the negative impacts, but what are whether it's the social networks, what are the pieces that perhaps you can focus on when rebuilding? Thinking about lead exposure and perhaps early childhood programming that can try to counter some of those neurodevelopment effects. So are there resiliency touch points that have been identified in prior research that communities can leverage when building back? And I would open that up, or if you've seen that in your own research.
Like you said, the problem we face initially and even today is the rapid recovery versus a little bit precaution. I was shocked when I saw all the cancer stuff coming after World Trade Center. But the recovery means opening up our tourist center. I mean, this is a tourist center for the state, and we're going broke. So some people say, well, Dr. Pan, you and your friends are alarmist, okay? Or you might say, let's just do both. Go ahead. Opening up as wide as you can, and then put on go ahead, put on your monitoring of these long cohorts. But in the end, if we just open that up, 20 years from now, they're going to say, well, who the heck signed this thing? We should have been precautious. So it'll come back on the people who can sign. That's easy. The issue that you guys didn't face, maybe you did, but it's hidden in New York, and maybe Flint. No, not Flint. Flint is like us. Besides the recovery, to bring back tourism and return to normalism, there's litigation. There's a question of, was somebody so negligent that I'm going to sue the heck out of that guy? And that puts a damper and a hush on everything. There's also litigation in the Red Hill issue. I mean, but in the World Trade Center, go ahead, you can try to sue Saudi Arabia for backing Osama bin Laden, but that's kind of not an issue. Watch. All the agencies will now pivot to something that there's not quite blame: forever chemicals. Okay? Let's all address that. Can we get behind that? Because it's a bad problem, but no litigation. Okay? So I just want to say, this hidden 800-pound gorilla that's blocking open dialogue, except in this room, whoa, they're going to call you alarmist, and then they're going to ask you to give up your license.
I just want to make one comment, which is, especially when you have cases where there's a compensation regulatory framework that's built in, like World Trade Center, maybe like Flint, be careful what you wish for. Because what's been seen time and time again is that compensation mechanisms often lead to corrosive communities, and it can actually tear communities apart if it's set up in such a way that some people think that they're getting something or somebody else got something that they didn't get. So it would have to be structured in a way maybe that the community felt it was getting it as a whole and as a collective, but, you know, or some balance like that, because it could go badly.
So just to answer your question, I think was what is the resilience that was seen? I think the cultural piece for this response, and we'll talk more tomorrow about that, but all of the different cultures that make up this community and seeing what that response was and how it looked differently. You saw all these different cultural health fairs pop up. I mean, Roots Reborn, our Native Hawaiian Health Center here. But even how you address mental health, and I think we'll talk about that tomorrow too, but traditional ways of what people think of mental health treatment or therapy. Now we see all these different modalities, whether it's gardening, yoga, music, art. There's so many different ways to address that mental health piece, and we don't even call it therapy necessarily, right? But we saw a lot of that. So I think that in the resilience piece, that is one thing that is so strong that was really seen in the immediate response. And we continue to see now. Yeah, thanks.
Dave Abramson, the 18-month mark, you talked about that, correct? We are at, oh wait, I just calculated it, approximately 16 months. Give us some thoughts on you coming from and knowing about the 18 months and what can be done, or how do we enable it to be a little bit more gentler, for lack of better words. Thank you.
So some of that depends on which funds we're talking about and when they started, because the clocks begin at different times for different funds. But I'm not sure what FEMA's Housing Allowance Fund and IA in particular, funding stream looks like. Maybe somebody else in the audience knows this, but I would say one thing that could be occurring is that in the next X number of months, maybe it's 2 to 6 months, people may start getting notices from FEMA that that's the end of the IA money. You know, it's like capped at, I don't know what, 30,000 total or something like that. But whatever, it's going to run out. And then whatever they were using for their housing and everyday costs is now on them. So that's one thing that I'd be looking at. I understand that I thought there was already CDBG DR money here, which is Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery money, and the answer is there isn't yet, and that's a big pot of money that could theoretically come to the state, and that comes with deadlines and funding limits as well. In some ways, the good news is it hasn't started yet, so you'll have it for a while if you get it. But it depends on which one, you know, which funding stream and where does it start. I would be worried about the FEMA IA money first.
When do we tell the community? The day before it runs out? Because I asked the question, I don't live here, but that's what I would be thinking about as soon as you told me about the 18-month thing. That's another thing that has to be built into this, or else, and it's not necessarily on MauiWES, okay? It's more on our politics, but it's also an important part for everybody that lives in Maui to know that there's going to be a deadline. There's going to be a stop. I really appreciate your time.
So I want to expand a little bit about on your point. So I want to ask you again. So like you have an N of 3 now, right? Is it correct? Disasters you've been tracking and looking at more than 3. Okay, a lot more. So the commonalities you talked about earlier, and I think we're starting to see that too, some of the common data elements that we can compare and some of the emerging issues after disaster that all folks go through, especially of course with the mental, emotional trauma that they are dealing with, in addition to being displaced and some of the other physical health challenges that emerge later. So, and of course with households, different dynamics, there are different time points through in the game of recovery. So I wonder, given our situation here, we are at the 16 months. Is that right, Susan? You kind of calculated towards, from the disaster. What do you think? I mean, obviously it's a different type of a disaster, it's wildfires versus hurricanes, but similar in terms of the tragic impacts that it has on households and individuals. Can you give us sort of a projection of what to expect in the next 6 to 12 months, even a couple of years out from now, of what we should be really, prioritizing in terms of looking at identifying areas we can start actually implementing for interventions? Of course, the obvious one is the mental health that we're trying to build more capacity around, but any other issues that we are potentially missing from our assessments that we should consider incorporating?
So, it's a hard one to answer. I would say, at the very least, housing is a linchpin for so much of this. And that's where that speed versus deliberation really is at a knife's edge, because it can go both ways. It's like you want to get the housing just right, and you don't want to wait so long that you've missed the time to settle people, because the longer people are not stably housed, the worse everything is. It has a cascading effect. It's going to have the effect on the household constraints, on the parents' mental health, then on the kids' mental health, then on their educational outcomes. So that in and of itself, housing is such a critical piece, but it's only one of many. And actually, to Ali's question about resilience, there is a literature around what are those aspects that you have to be paying attention to. And one thing that we've looked at over the years, there are 4 types of capital that both individuals and communities have to get and have in order to be able to recover. They have to have economic capital, they have to have social capital, they have to have human capital, and they have to have political capital. And if they can essentially acquire those or use what they have, those capitals, when they're accumulated, will help them recover. And each one has like a different aspect that you've got to work on to get. So I'm not sure if that helps. It's a little abstract. I'm sorry. That's the way, as you know, we scientists tend to think.
Well, thank you. It does help. Any other comments on that? Suggestions from the audience? Lisa?
So Lisa Sanchez Johnson again, from the Medical College of Wisconsin, University of Hawaii as well. So I work as a co-investigator for the All of Us research program. I'm not sure if anybody is familiar with this. This is the largest NIH-funded study ever in the history of NIH, designed to recruit and enroll 1 million people across the United States. And this has been going on for a number of years now, and the funding structure has changed a little bit as of recently. And so the concerns that always raise to my mind is, of course, what happens when the funding ends, but even if, because at some point it might end, right? But instead of just focusing on that part, thinking now about what can be done now, how do you continue to give back to the community? This is why what you do is so unique in terms of the dashboard, to make it accessible, that people have the resources right away. And of course, as we know, not everybody is going to go to the dashboard, right? So to continue to do those community outreach activities, that will continue to be important. And again, the other things that we can all think about is how, as Pedro has said, like, what can we do to contribute, right? What are other people's expertise? What can they bring? So maybe there'll be a way that we can also have everybody else lift up their voices to have a platform for, this is what I can donate, this is what I can do to continue to lift up our communities.
Yeah, mahalo. I like this idea of building on measuring sort of resilience factors as well. I think oftentimes that's lost in a lot of these disparities studies because we're so focused on the disparities. And I kind of want to hear more about that. I think we touched on a little bit, Nicole, you mentioned some of that with the community engagement. I believe also we heard a little bit about that post-traumatic growth metric. Yep, that you mentioned earlier too. I'm actually really interested in learning more about what that metric looks like and how it can be used and what you're seeing already maybe emerging from the data that you've been collecting. But some aspects of, really building in what is it about the recovery that will help people, strengthen and hopefully maybe enable prevention of these kinds of issues that we're seeing. And part of it, we kind of mentioned a little bit of that social support. There's a lot more hidden in that data, I'm sure, that we have to look at to kind of get a more granular level of what's about the social support that's really, contributing to this protective effect. But I wonder if from the audience and other experiences, what are the emerging or maybe some of the established sort of metrics that you have learned to consider in disaster recovery, and that could be robust, resilient markers that we should be considering incorporating into our approach, but also to potentially leverage what we learned from that to help shape policy and enable some of the practices to emerge.
And I think just to follow up on that, since that was actually in my line of thought, Maui was one disaster, but there is going to be more coming. Like, what are the type of things that we can do right now to prevent, basically be resilient to these disasters moving forward?
Well, there's that, and then there's the idea that we still have an outstanding issue with chronic disease. We still have an issue we still have an issue with a lack of access to health care, right, for a great deal of our populations, that it's only going to be exacerbated by not just the fires in Maui, but whatever is coming next, right? COVID right before that, it hasn't been, in each of these things has put to the forefront issues that we knew existed, but and that we knew were important, but we've been taking care of emergencies versus important. We've been taking care of what's right in front of us versus being able to prepare for the future. And I think that there's some cross-cutting issues, such as access to housing, access to healthcare, that will continue to be a cross-cutting issue for any of the crises that we may face as a state. That's why it's really heartening to see an organization like Kaiser, which is incredibly huge. I always talk about how quickly can you move a boat, right? So some things are a nice little speedboat, and some things are huge cruise lines that are not as quickly as. So it's really great to be able to see an organization like Kaiser be able to move like a speedboat, rather than moving like a cruise liner, even though we know that there's a large bureaucratic system that they have to work under. And so those are outstanding issues that we continue to battle with, access to healthcare, access to, paying wages, the fact that we worked on minimum wage, in this past few years, are able to prepare us better as a state. And the problem is that we keep waiting for these crises to happen to say, oh, now we should work on this. Now we should really think about housing on West Maui. Well, that's been an issue for, 30 years? And we can't wait until another crisis happens, as you're alluding to. But the idea of what we can be doing now is chronic disease. What are we doing to fund that plume of smoke, that simulation that happened? They don't have any direct funding either. They're tracking the VOG on Mauna Kea that is going to exacerbate asthma symptoms and pulmonary symptoms, not just for the people that were exposed in the Maui fires that now have developed new symptoms, but for everybody else that we already had on the islands. There's no funding for that. We don't invest in preventive care as a state. And that is a huge underlying issue, I think, that it's going to affect our future crises and that is affecting everybody else in the state now.
So I kind of feel like you guys are the tail wagging the dog. You're the research study, the academic center that, along with your community partners, are trying to wag a much larger dog, the dog of these major disparities, major structural problems that you're trying and hoping to fix. And I actually think you have an opportunity here, which is one thing you could do is you could say to the decision makers here, we're doing this little study about what recovery looks like when it's done well in another community. And I would recommend that you look at Joplin, Missouri, which experienced an EF5 tornado that was horrific. Very quick, 160 people died in this, about 80,000 people lived there. Maybe a third of their housing was destroyed or something enormous like that. And they managed to come back, and they are like the poster child of a resilient community. And they did that with an incredible community engagement effort tied with community leadership. And so if you were to invite the decision makers to join you on a fact-finding little case study to Joplin to see what happened, you might actually be able to wag that dog to get the community engaged in that deliberation process now, because they would be able to see, oh, that's how you make it happen. Joplin ended up going through this community engagement process and then having a set of goals and objectives derived from the community of what kind of community they wanted to live in, what was going to be the healthy community, the thriving community, the one that would help them flourish. And they turned that into a master development plan. And that is what guided their redevelopment. You know, you could sort of bring the decision makers with you and let them come to that decision themselves, and they could pat themselves on the back. And you've wagged that dog.
That's a good point. I wonder what our community partners think about this too. I mean, maybe empowering them into helping us advocate for that kind of support for building a healthier community and what that looks like. Yeah, there has been like myriad of efforts. I mean, we have examples of stories from, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Malamakula, but an organization that started also in the wake of the fires in Kula, where just a community member, a resident there, decided he needed to figure out how there was potential contaminants from the ash that they've been exposed to of the fire. So he did a Herculean effort reaching out to community partners as well as other organizations and agencies to learn more about that and then spread the word in his neighborhood. So maybe that's something that we should figure out how to like support more, are these grassroots community efforts to help us build that capacity and then advocate for what they would see as a more resilient, healthier community that they need to incorporate, not just the housing, but consider these other factors that really should be included in terms of understanding how they can prevent these conditions that are emerging that we know about, and then, provide more access and support, maybe in education, as well as resourcing, some of these specialty care that we need, trying to provide that kind of approach as well. But we have more questions, or discussion.
I want to bring it back to funding, okay? And one of the things that Hawaii Community Health, myself and Dana to begin with, participated in last year was testifying at the legislature. And that's something that if we're going there again, then we need to also prepare, because that's another thing that's like right around the corner. We've got new people in the House and in the Senate. And, we can't start January. And if we're going to participate actively to try and get funding, because I don't know where you're going to get it from. I mean, I would like to not have to ask the legislature and have some people donate money. But I'm here with you on that and doing that, my part of that, coming around the corner. Because I can talk.
As far as like building resilience and looking forward rather than looking backwards, one thought that comes to mind through the conversations that I've had and listening to the talks is, and this is a baby thought, so if it's premature, forgive me, but working together, especially as two registries develop at the same time in Hawaii and being in their infancy together, but there's a lot of toxic exposure in Hawaii, and I'm learned about continuing medical education, and that's something that maybe Hawaii could require is toxic exposure and being able to treat patients with various toxic exposures, because it's not a one island problem. That was one thought that came to mind, and it's a forward-looking thing for preventative health that I think that could be advocated for, and not only here, but registries in other states, would have their own little special areas of those concerns. And then something else that comes to mind for me, trust is always a big area of focus, and it's a big part of my research questions. But looking at trust and that loss of trust, I've heard that a lot from a lot of different speakers and having to deal with that. And as a registry, maybe the trust in ourselves hasn't been in the registry itself, or the institution putting the registry together hasn't been lost, but just a complete loss of trust in institutions altogether, or that institutional betrayal that the community has been suffering. And so one piece before you can rebuild trust is if something depletes, sometimes you have a distrust management phase. And I think that often gets overlooked. And a few of the speakers have talked about ways of reciprocal trust and different things that really just kind of highlighted that era of sitting in distrust and acknowledging that they're not just going to trust me because I say I'm trustworthy. And so I just really appreciated that. And that's like the looking backwards piece that stands out to me.
Thank you guys so much. My name is Tori. I'm from Maliola Pharmacy, locally independent Native Hawaiian-owned pharmacy in town. I just wanted to thank you guys for, providing this opportunity. I think one of the things that we noticed the most during this tragedy was cultural competency as far as the healthcare side. So I think as we're asking, like, what does that resilience look like? I think every disaster that was presented in front of us today has its own unique tragedy that was brought to it, and also the disparities. But Hawaii is very specific, and I think Maui in particular, so meeting the community where they're at is something that we've noticed has been a difficulty, but also an opportunity. So again, this is not the entire community here, so it's very hard to speak on that and to share more in light of it, but I think that is something that is very unique to us here. And by cultural competency, I mean all of the different melting pots of cultures that belong here, but especially the Native Hawaiian culture. And just to kind of share, we did meet with the federally qualified health centers here on island, which is Malama Ikeola, and we've worked with them pretty much throughout the entire time of the wildfires. And HRSA actually came to visit and sat in front of us and asked us a lot of questions about, what did you guys do and what are you gonna do? And especially addressing a lot of the mental health issues. And what we kind of said was that we are going to, one of the focuses is return to Aina, especially for these kids, right? Getting their hands in the places that they are and the places that they're from. And I remember one of the questions from the psychologist, and just kind of going back to what Heidi said about how we view mental health here. And one of the psychologists said, okay, well, that's great, but what about all of the non-Native Hawaiian kids? And I think that's the part of the cultural competency that we need to address, because that's all of the kids here. We don't look at them differently as far as who's allowed to put their hands in the Aina and who's allowed to have these opportunities. And we kind of look at everyone as each other. And so I think that's just something that's very unique to us here, and that I just wanted to share.
Yeah, I think the fact that, and I think that's what I appreciate about the way that the MauiWES has been created, is that the people who are at the top, the people who are advising, look like the community of which it's trying to help, right? And that's one thing that we often are missing, is that, a Native Hawaiian-owned pharmacy, managed pharmacy, is a not the regular model of what we're used to seeing. I'll just put it that way. But it's important, right? It's important as to who's on the table. So let me other than of course the district office for Department of Health, do we have Department of Health staff, state staff? Okay. Department of Education? Health and Human Services? Hawaii Community Foundation? Yeah. Okay, we're here. Okay. Who was here? Okay. Okay, wonderful. Policymakers? All right. So yeah. So they were all invited. So I mean, I think that along with the representation of the community, there has to be representation from the people that make the decisions for that community, to be able to hear directly from the community. That has been a huge criticism for the people of Lahaina. They want to be able to talk directly to the people who are making these decisions. I am unsure as to who's making the decisions for the Hawaii Community Foundation Maui Strong Fund. I am unsure as to the decisions that have been decided and what has been funded and what hasn't been funded, and what is their long-term strategy for those dollars. It seems that it would be prudent for those policymakers to come in be able to see, be able to talk directly, and be able to say, what do you need, rather than working only through applications that are being submitted. And so there is this sort of like community, helping community members, people that are working to create that, and then there's sort of like this blind spot of being able to see what the community health centers are doing, what different people are doing. And again, looking at Kaiser, it's not like it can't be done. It's not like it can't be done. It's not like our bureaucracy is going to stop us from doing that. So I think that what we can do, you all have partners in all of those agencies. You all have partners, you know, whether you're from a federal agency or whether you're working locally. I challenge you to go back and ask and say, hey, why aren't you at this thing? It was really great. Here are the points that I was able to learn about. And here are the people that I think you should be contacting with. Because I think it's important for them to be able to be in the room, to be able to hear directly from the people that are doing the work, to be able to understand those needs.
Sorry, I just wanted to mention with all the data you're collecting, we obviously know there's a need, but then there's also like a healthcare infrastructure, like there's not that many. Obviously, there's only like 2 federally qualified health center here, and one is in Hana, and everyone else goes to Malama Ikeola. So even if we have all these needs, the only resource, like as a public health nurse, is referring them to Malama, but I think we're overwhelming their healthcare system. Other than Kaiser, you know, we're pretty limited, and so I think with the data that you have, I think asking for more help for services here that can be easily accessible and in a manner that's not normally accessible by like Western medicine, maybe in another way. Because when we go to these outreaches that we do, some of them do healthcare insurance, but they don't seek those services, and so they don't prevent the needs that they have. And it might be because it's not the way they're used to seeking out services. And so that's something that I think we should kind of acknowledge and promote to people that make decisions, I guess.
No, that's a great point. Actually, we should even consider looking at what our participants in the study are actually doing for care. Like what other sorts, not just the traditional sort of medical, you know, practices or more alternative or other forms of care. More holistic approaches. I wonder if that's actually, we can start to see some of that from our data. So that's a good point, Mahalo. Then we had,
I just wanted to sort of expand, because I think the other important piece for whether it's for policymakers or thinking about it from sort of a hospital perspective is understanding, you know, the cost and benefits and healthcare savings that could be made. So I guess the other piece that I wonder if there's a way to incorporate, and I'll look at you for this, is how to think about using the data and whether it's projecting out costs related to NCDs and thinking about preventative care and how trying to develop some sort of a care model or care structure, enhancing care options, actually is going to save the government money. You know, I think going to them with like, you know, we need all this stuff, I think until you actually show them, right, yeah. But I'll look to the economist. And
I know, and we have been trying to look into that, especially with medical records, try to collect basically some of the costs and potentially do the projections, right? Yeah, see that works.
Dr. Larson started off with talking about the value of setting up a registry, and one of the points he said was return on investment. He kind of glossed over that quickly. Then we had a presentation by Kaiser, who said, oh, we're going to see these guys in the primary care setting, but no one quite said, where's the return on investment? You got two ways to do this, return on investment. Like, I tried to set up the registry and I only enrolled 10% of my target. That's not a great return. But the true return on investment is dollar for dollar. And if Kaiser is going to see a lot of guys in the primary care setting and avoid expensive ER visits and hospitalizations because the whole thing collapsed, then I like Kaiser because they will keep the returns in their own system. When we do it for Department of Health and you save them money, oral hygiene, because you prevent things, that just goes into the general funds. And thank you, and we'll mention you by name for being whatever. But the money didn't return, okay? So It's nice, Kaiser. I'm on the board of a community clinic, vice president. They tried to go out. They did go out. But so many people are coming to them now, so they can't do the street medicine. But they have not argued for all the ER visits they've prevented, okay? Because the feds will just fund them.
Just to sort of expand on that, so there's a physician researcher at CHOP. Her name is Dr. Tyra Bryant-Stevens, and she does a lot of work with asthma research. And I would encourage you guys to look into it because it's incredible work. It's very community engaged, and essentially what she's looked at is asthma exacerbations and children who have frequent asthma exacerbations. And there's a lot around sort of reimbursement structures where hospitals start to lose money, lose reimbursements for kids who keep coming in with exacerbations. And so through her research and involving a health economist in her research, she demonstrated that CHOP would actually save money by going into the children's homes and getting rid of mold, ripping out carpets, sealing up the homes so that they didn't have, cockroach infestations, to the tune of, I believe it's around $20,000 per house. And CHOP now pays for that because in the long run it saves them money. And she did this through involving a health economist in all of the work so that she could then demonstrate to the hospital that this actually saves them money and to invest in the community. So I think there are structures or there are models around doing this that have been really successful. And, I think in terms of preventative care might be really important to investigate.
I wanted to follow up on the suggestion for a community or continuing medical education. That one thing we did about 2008 is the community noticed their neighbors and themselves were not being properly treated for the conditions coming out of World Trade Center. So they came to us and said, what can you do to teach the clinicians that we're being seen by to help them know what to do? So we put together a committee of clinicians who were treating the people and developed clinical guidelines that were fairly short, but really pointed about this is what you do for PTSD, this is what you do for asthma, this is what you do for all the things you're seeing in your research. And it doesn't have to be a long document, but we then printed it and we're now sending it to all our enrollees to take with them when they go to see the doctor. And it's been a small incremental effect, but it does get the community involved in their medical care in a different way. And it ultimately showed it was not successful, but it led in part to the development of the World Trade Center Health Program because they realized the community docs really were too busy and couldn't really focus on it. So that's why they had to create another system, and it turns out to be fairly expensive. But so I just wonder if maybe even a brief clinical guideline developed by your clinicians could help in at least moving that process forward.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Cohen. That's actually a suggestion that we've been working on as well, trying to develop a pathway for the educating the providers. So we have actually some family medicine docs that in our team that are helping us develop curriculum around that to kind of provide that. And in addition, incorporating that with cultural competency training so that they can understand and communicate to patients about potential exposures, specific issues that might be coming out from the disaster that they should be paying attention to and how to manage their care better. So that's ongoing, but I'd like to pick your brain on your experiences on that too. So thank you for that.
Learned so much today. It's been terrific to be involved in. What a great conversation. One of the topics just been barely touched on, but I really think is the 800-pound gorilla, is the cost of housing and the cost of living. So to give a fuzzy idea of what the runway is, FEMA postponed the end of the housing program to February of 26. So about a little bit more time. But we know that before the fire, Maui was, depending upon who you listen to, 7,000 units short, maybe 15,000 units short, lost another 2,000 units. Got the FEMA program that has caused the escalation in the price of housing. I mentioned previously 39% of healthcare professionals on Maui are saying, they're considering leaving, and they're considering leaving because they can't afford to stay here. following the fires, we had set up a mobile health vehicle in Napili Park. I was there one afternoon talking to some of the nurses. Both had lost their homes in the wildfire. One had already moved, 4 or 5 times, different hotels. Another one had more stable housing, but they both shared with me they didn't think that they would be able to stay on Maui, following the recovery. So I don't know what the answer is here, but we can't sustain $1.2 million median single-family home price or a $780,000 statewide all units median price. Only 1 in 5 families in Hawaii can afford that type of housing. And again, I don't have the answer, but I just want to put that front and center. I think that is, if we don't solve that, I don't see how we move forward on so many of these other issues.
So I wanted to be able to connect 2 points, actually. The point that was made about housing and also the point that was made about, the cost and the savings of investing in preventive care. We're talking about system-wide, right? But the cost to the individual family, for an emergency room visit, that's how we perpetuate poverty, right? By not investing in preventive care, by them not having access to affordable housing that they can own and pass generational wealth across families. We keep perpetuating, and we know who those people are. They tend to be Native Hawaiian, they tend to be immigrants, they tend to be all the same people that are going to have a hard time rebuilding the most after the fires, all the same people that are going to have a hard time recuperating after an emergency room visit due to the cost. And so, when I mentioned, that a high tide lifts all boats, it's the same issues time and time and time again. It's housing, it's access to healthcare, it's good available jobs for our communities. It's in our resilience after these crises is dependent as to how much deep we invest on those things ahead of time. And unfortunately, we sort of keep putting Band-Aid. I don't think the tiny homes are going to fix the problem of housing in the long term. It's an immediate, Band-Aid fix, but I've yet to hear a solution after FEMA moves away from paying those rents from any of our elected officials. And so I think we have to be able to have those discussions outside of this room. We have to be able to have the spine to be able to bring this up in uncomfortable situations. We have to be the people that are stirring the pot. So that they are able to determine a Band-Aid fix is not gonna do it anymore.
As a clinical psychologist, and I'm on the board of the Hawaii Psychological Association as well, but I'm speaking as an individual and as a faculty member as well, and I want to address the question about resilience, and it is incredibly important, right? The corollary to resilience is what are we doing to address burnout? But sometimes when we focus so much on resilience, when I speak to people, they say that they can sometimes feel like you're blaming them because they're not being resilient enough, right? Because it's such an individualized construct, and we sometimes forget about what organizational role is in terms of addressing burnout. So I want to make sure we're always, paying attention to both sides of the coin about what organizations can do to build resilience, and to make sure that we are paying attention to the individuals and to ourselves, right? That are. It's not that we just need to be more resilient, although there is definitely a body of literature on how to do that. Right? Berkeley has this organization called I think it's the Science for the Greater Good. And I always use their curriculum. It's to build resilience, to build wellness. One of the tactics is paying attention to gratitude. But at the same time, I'm not saying be more thankful for what you have, right? We need to also pay attention to the individual. I will wrap up by saying that these are incredibly painful moments that people are going through right now, and I think that just the sitting and listening and being attentive is going to be, go a very long way. We've emphasized throughout, right, the importance of mental health issues and how to address this. We need more providers. I don't have the solution here. I'm just sprinkling in that one of the pearls is not just being resilient, but it's that installation of hope, Yalam, who was an expert in group therapy, that installation of hope, it's what brings people to therapy in the first place, because they think, oh, this is what's going to help me, right? It also helps with suicide, prevention. We have to make sure that we're continuing to instill hope in everybody and in ourselves as well. So thank you.
Hi, thank you. Reiterate what everybody says, thank you. I'm Stephanie Wagner. I'm the newly hired referral manager of the Red Hill Registry. I'm week 3 on the job. But my background's as a registered nurse, and talking about billing, I had my own small medical private practice in New York City doing lactation consulting, so I learned a lot about billing that you're not normally taught working hospital nursing. Has anybody ever worked in any of these groups with the WHO to write ICD coding for billing for practitioners? Because so much in getting medical help, and a provider may want to help, but if they don't know how to code or bill, we had an example brought up, we've done some focus groups, that somebody said a specialist, they saw the closest ICD code they could find was bathwater toxins, and that's essentially how they charted and billed, but this person was like, I didn't get sick from just taking a random bath, this was drinking water over a prolonged period of time. So has anybody ever worked with the World Health Organization for ICD code billing, and anybody have any ideas of how that would work to try to regulate healthcare providers as far as billing?
So Stephanie, I don't think that this exists. I mean, this is why building these registries are important, right? Because we want to be able to track individuals as they move along, change insurances, etc., right? But I mean, it would be awesome if we could develop that. But yeah.
My name is Dr. Chris Knightsbridge. I've been helping out with mental health consultations at the end of the protocol. I think it's important to note that this has become far more than just kind of like a study. There's a lot of like actual intervention going on. Like at the end of the protocol, like either me or Dr. Palamikir that gets the help with the mental health consultation, like we get to have these one-on-one conversations with each community member and make sure that they're okay. If they're not okay, then we can contact them later, have a longer conversation, direct them to the right social services or therapy, place them into therapists that we kind of vet and we know that they're gonna be there long-term, because you don't want to send to somebody that's going to open up about their trauma for 3 months, then have to go to another therapist and reopen that trauma. So that's just what I wanted to highlight. I mean, this thing has become like far bigger, in my opinion at least, than just like, hey, let's just test for these toxic metals. And it's like a really unique opportunity to get the community help. And like so many community members have just like broken down in tears, like while I'm talking to them. And I'm like, well, like it's been a year now. Like who have you talked to about all this horrible stuff that's been going on? And almost the universal answer is nobody. Like nobody. Like I'm the first dude that they've opened up to talk about this stuff. So yeah, I'm just grateful to be a part of it. And I also think it's quite amazing that like none of this would have happened if Alika and Ruben didn't even just like think of it. Like literally just like you got 2 guys that are like, oh, let's just do this. Like, what if you didn't? Like what if you didn't? And I don't think there's no 2 other people that were like gonna do it. So it just kind of boggles my mind. And I guess since it's near the end, I just wanted to end on a positive note and just say how grateful I think I am and so many of us are. So thanks. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.